Hello and a warm welcome to BBC Learning Zone on BBC Two. Coming up, programmes for schools. This morning the focus is on GCSE bite-sized revision in science. Later at 4 o'clock we'll be homing in on physics. Before that, we cover further aspects of the three main science subjects for those students preparing to take their higher tier tests.
Hi, I'm Katie Natman and welcome to the third science programme in the Key Stage 3 Bite-Sized Revision series. Programmes 1 and 2 cover most of the material you need to revise for, up to level 6. This third programme is designed for you if you're taking the higher tier paper, which covers levels 5 to 7. There are 2 tiers of test paper for science that you can be put in for, and your teacher will decide which one you will be taking. Either levels 3 to 6 or the higher paper, which covers levels 5 to 7. The tiers do overlap and many questions appear in both papers, but obviously there are some harder questions in the higher paper. In this programme for levels 5 to 7, we will go into greater detail of those topics that appear in the higher level paper. And we've still included lots of practice questions, more top tips, and those crucial key points you need to remember. So, what's coming up in this programme? We've divided up the next 2 hours into 3 main sections: biology, chemistry, and physics. But we'll start with an introduction to the higher tier paper. If you want, you can fast forward to the subject you need most help with, and the on-screen clock will keep track of where you are in the programme. If you're taking the higher tier papers, it's just as important to use the other 2 programmes in this series for your revision as well. All 3 programmes need to be watched to make sure that you have covered everything and that you're well prepared for your test. If you want more practice, you could try the Key Stage 3 Bite-Sized book or our own unique online website. Both have lots more info and practice questions, so there's lots of different ways to revise for your tests. Try not to tackle this programme in one chunk. You'll be much more efficient if you spread your revision out over a number of weeks. Here are some more top tips to help you.
Try not to revise too much the night before, because I found that the things that I'd done 2 weeks before had actually stuck much better in my head than the things I'd revised the night before the test.
For biology, I use flashcards for keywords and facts. The way I revised was to make lists and little notes and diagrams next to it, and also I got people to test me on them.
Some good advice there. And here are some important points you need to take on board when sitting the higher tier papers. First and most important, read the questions carefully. There will be clues in the question that will help you with your answer. Don't rush the first questions in the paper. They may seem easier, but there are lots of marks to be picked up here, so take your time and concentrate. Make sure you use the right scientific language. For instance, a light wave is reflected, not bounced off a mirror. And be careful over calculations, and don't forget their units. You can pick up marks by using the correct units. But above all, knowing your work will make you more confident and help with answering questions. So, let's get started. The first area we're going to look at is biology. If you're familiar with this section, you may wish to fast forward to the chemistry or the physics sections. The biology sections are split into 3 units, so we'll kick off with feeding relationships in food webs. This unit is split into three main sections: energy in food webs, population size, and toxic materials in food webs. Let's start with energy in food webs. First of all, we will briefly run through what you should already know about food chains. In a nutshell, food chains show in any particular habitat what is eaten by what. Now, this fish tank represents a typical habitat, a rather murky garden pond, but still teeming with organisms. And one food chain here could start with waterweed, which is eaten by tadpoles, which in turn would be eaten by larger carnivores, water beetles and fish such as minnows. And remember, in a food chain, the arrows always go from food to feeder. So in this case, from waterweed to tadpoles to minnows. Now, in a test, you will often get diagrams like this. Basically, the food chain has become a lot more complicated, and this is now called a food web. The same principle applies. The arrows go from food to feeder. But here, we have added water beetles, perch, then pike, and top carnivores, otters. These arrows also represent the direction of energy flow through a habitat. And as you go up a particular food chain, the number of organisms decreases. So if we look at another food chain, we can start with leaves that are eaten by caterpillars, and then woodpeckers, and finally the top carnivore is one kestrel. As we go up the food chain, the number of organisms goes down. Now, why is this? Well, it's to do with energy. There are fewer organisms as we go up a particular food chain because the energy flow along a food chain is very inefficient.
But how much is passed on? Well, if we use this spot of sunlight to represent the sun's light energy shining on a green plant, how much does the plant manage to convert to stored food energy? 66%. 33%. In fact, this much, 0.2%. Only 1/500th of the sun's light energy is transferred to the start of a food chain.
So if all the energy that's stored in the plant and is available to the animals that eat it is represented by this light, how much is transferred to that animal? 90%? 50%? No, the amount of energy transferred to the animals is around 10%.
But what happens to the 90% that isn't? Well, it's not available to the food chain because it's the energy the plant needs each and every day to survive. And it's the energy that drives all the reactions to make new cells, which in turn produces leaves, flowers, and seeds. In fact, all levels of the food chain only transfer 10% of the energy they receive onto the next level.
So 90% of energy is lost from food chains, but it does keep everything alive. Here are some facts about food chains you really need to know well in order to answer test questions. So for food chains, the arrows always go from food to feeder, not the other way round. The arrows also represent the energy flow along a food chain, and the amount of usable energy decreases as we go up a food chain. And because the energy transfer is very inefficient, the number of organisms it can support decreases as you go along a food chain. The energy in any food chain originally comes from the sun and is converted into biomass by photosynthesis. So to sum up this section, feeding relationships in a particular habitat can be summarized using a food web. If you weren't sure of anything, rewind the tape and go over the key points again. The next section in this unit looks at population size. Population size is how many of one particular type of plant or animal there is in a habitat. But the population of a particular organism doesn't just keep on rising. In fact, sometimes something happens and the population, rather than rising, goes into freefall and starts declining. In the next clip, try and note down the factors that are affecting the size of the barn owl population.
Barn owls like this are under threat. They're not producing enough young to keep the species going. I'm here to investigate what's being done about it. So why aren't barn owls producing enough young?
Well, to understand that, we've got to look at their food chain.
OK, at the bottom you've got grass, and that's eaten by small mammals like voles and mice, and the voles and mice are in turn eaten by the barn owls.
Yes, but it's the number of small mammals that's so important.
Right, because the number of small mammals will directly control the number of owls that can live in a given area.
Exactly.
So why is there such a shortage of small mammals? I mean, there's hardly a shortage of grass. It's everywhere.
Yes, but it's not the quantity, it's the quality of rough grass. If we look at this area here, it's all short, close-cropped, well-grazed, and voles can't make their nests, they can't make their runs, and they can't hide.
So as this grass is too short for small mammals to live in, it means there's not enough food for owls. So the owls won't breed.
Yes, they won't breed, and the species will die out.
So what the owls need to do is move to an area where hunting can be made more efficient. Well, somewhere suitable for small mammals.
Yes, come on, I'll show you.
I guess that means grassland that would give them good cover.
Well, this meadow is excellent because there's this rough, tussocky grassland here. Well, I'm sure if we look hard, we might find vole run. Yeah, here we are. Here, look. Here's a vole run, and in here are the small clippings of grass, which is their food store. So this area is alive with small mammals.
Colin's put an owl box here, as there are no natural nesting places in the area. These are young owls, which shows the parents are breeding. They're checked to make sure they're growing into healthy adults. It won't be long before they fly off for good, and soon they'll be starting families of their own to continue the species.
So, have you noted down the two factors here that are affecting the size of the barn owl population? You should have found that the owl population is decreasing because of a lack of food supply. The habitat of the small mammals they feed on is disappearing. And there were few suitable nesting places, so artificial owl boxes have been put up. The size of a population is controlled by three major factors: adaptation, competition from other species for food, water and shelter, and predation. That's being eaten as food by animals further up the food chain. A tip on remembering these things is to draw a triangle and put the population size in the middle. The three controlling factors are added to the sides: adaptation, competition and predation. Now, predators themselves are affected by these things, particularly their own food supply, their prey. But how? This is a classic example of a predator-prey cycle. If the hare population increases, this supplies more food for the lynx, the predator. This results in an increase in the lynx population. However, more lynx results in less hares, which in time results in less lynx again. These fluctuating population sizes are typical of lots of predator-prey relationships. The population size of any species is controlled by three main factors: adaptation, how well the species is suited to its environment; competition, how successful are the species competing with other species for the same resources, food, water, or shelter; predation, how predators affect the size of the population and how many there are. Remember, in the last section, we showed you this food web in a typical British river. The question is, what would happen if the minnows were removed? Three things will happen, so 3 marks have been awarded for this answer. Why not pause the tape and have a think about it? Well, if the minnows were removed from this food web, 3 things would happen. 1, the tadpoles won't get eaten, so their numbers will increase. 2. Water beetles will get eaten more by hungry perch who haven't got minnows to feast on. And 3. The water weed will diminish since the number of tadpoles will increase. The relationships in these food webs can get quite complicated. If you weren't sure of the answer, why not rewind and go over this section again? If you're happy to carry on, let's find out what happens when toxic materials enter a food web. Another factor that affects the size of populations is the activity of humans, either by producing pollution or by leaving toxic substances in the environment. Sometimes these toxic, poisonous substances get into and are passed along a food chain. The plants and animals near the start of a food chain are usually unharmed by the relatively low concentrations of poison. But as it passes along the chain, it becomes more concentrated, so the animals at the top of the chain take in large amounts of the poison, which their bodies can't get rid of. And this is exactly what happened to some animals and birds. In the 1960s, seeds were often dipped in pesticide to protect them from pests. Some birds of prey, like the peregrine falcons, which are top carnivores at the top of the food chain, started dying out. Their bodies had large amounts of poisonous pesticides. One of the side effects was that the newly laid eggs had thin shells which would easily break before the chicks were ready to hatch. Now these pesticides are banned and peregrine falcons are increasing in numbers again. This brings us to the end of this first biology unit. If you weren't sure of anything, stop and go back. Or for a change, why not use the Bitesize book or try our unique online website. Remember, it's your choice. This next unit is going to look at specialized animal and plant cells. First, specialized animal cells. The shape of the cell and its structure depends on its particular function. That's the job it does. You need to know how a variety of different cells are adapted to their job, their function. We're going to look at two specialized animal cells, sperm cells and ciliated epithelial cells. Let's start with a sperm cell. The function of the sperm cell is to carry the male genetic information to the ovum and bring about fertilization. Once released, the sperm must swim from the vagina up into the fallopian tube, where it may fuse with an ovum. The structure of the cell is highly specialized, with a number of particular adaptations that make it very good at what it does. The sperm cell has 4 major adaptations which make it better at its job. 1, it has a tail that enables it to swim along. 2, the nucleus contains only half the genetic information. 3, enzymes on the head of the sperm enable it to digest its way through the ovum membrane. And 4, it has lots of mitochondria between the head and the tail, which provides the much needed energy for swimming. It's really important to understand the differences between adaptation and function. A really common mistake when a test question asks about how a cell is adapted is to give an answer describing its function, what it does. So let's sort out what we mean by adaptation and function. Adaptation is how a cell is suited to its job. So with a sperm cell, this would be a long tail for movement and half the genetic information. Function is what a cell does, its job. So with a sperm cell, its job is to fertilize an egg. Another completely different type of animal cell is the ciliated epithelial cell. These cells line all the air passages from your nose to the bottom of your lungs. Cilia are tiny hair-like structures on the surface of the cell. The hairs sweep mucus, trapped dust and bacteria up to the back of the throat, where it can then be swallowed. The cilia beat together to move the liquid or particles, and the many mitochondria in the cell release energy from food to provide energy to make the cilia move. Ciliated epithelial cells don't just appear in the respiratory system, but anywhere where material or substances need to be moved along. So these types of cells will also appear in the digestive system and in the reproductive system. Now, on the higher tier paper, you could get a question about a specialized cell you haven't actually studied or come across. A question designed to see if you can apply your knowledge and the facts you've learnt to a different situation. Let's try one. This is a picture of a nerve cell. Can you describe how it's adapted to its function? So you need to look at the diagram and work out how this cell is suited to its job. Your answer could be that you can tell that a nerve cell is adapted to its function because it has a long, thin structure with many points so it can carry nerve impulses, messages, back and forth. The next section in this unit looks at specialized plant cells. Like animal cells, plant cells have a nucleus, cytoplasm and a cell membrane, but they also have three other structures: the plant cell wall made up of cellulose, a large vacuole and chloroplasts for photosynthesis. Now, not all plant cells have chloroplasts, and in this first specialized plant cell we will see that there is no need for chloroplasts, as these particular cells live underground and form the plant's roots. Here's a cross-section of a plant's root. The root hair cell has a long hair-like structure that comes out from the body of the cell. This increases its surface area and enables the uptake of water and minerals to take place more efficiently. There is no waxy layer on the outside, and the thin cell wall allows for quicker uptake of water, and no chloroplasts are found because, being underground, there is no light for photosynthesis. At the opposite end of a plant, the palisade cells can be found in the upper part of all leaves. Their function is to enable photosynthesis to be carried out efficiently, and they have several adaptations you need to be familiar with. Palisade cells have a large surface area for the absorption of carbon dioxide and light. They are also packed with chloroplasts, which are arranged in the cell so that they are nearer to the leaf surface, which faces the sun. This means that more chloroplasts are exposed to a high light intensity. So let's just go over the main functions and adaptations of root hair cells and palisade cells. So the function of root hair cells is to absorb water and mineral salts from the soil. Their adaptations are a large surface area and a thin cell wall. With palisade cells, their function is to provide a site for photosynthesis, and they are adapted to this task by having a large surface area and are packed full of chloroplasts. That brings us to the end of this unit on specialized cells. Can you remember the difference between adaptation and function? If you're unsure, why not rewind and check out the key points again? Or if you're happy with this unit, this would be a good point to take a break. It's up to you. The final section in biology looks at life processes. We'll kick off with photosynthesis. Let's just remind ourselves about photosynthesis. Photosynthesis is the process where green plants make their own food using the energy from the sun in the presence of chlorophyll. Watch this next clip and see if you can write down the 4 components that are needed for photosynthesis.
All green plants need sunlight to make their own food. The process is called photosynthesis. Photosynthesis happens in the leaves. They contain a special green pigment called chlorophyll, which traps sunlight. The leaf, in all its shapes and sizes, is actually a food factory. In photosynthesis, it takes raw materials from the environment and uses them with sunlight to produce sugar. This is the food it then uses to grow. Photosynthesis can be described by an equation. carbon dioxide plus water, with the sun's energy, produces oxygen and sugar. At nightfall, with no sunlight, plants can't photosynthesize. But as the sun rises, the food factories are back to work again.
You should have come up with 4 things that are needed for photosynthesis. Carbon dioxide and water, the raw ingredients. Sunlight, which provides the energy, and chlorophyll in the green leaves, which acts as a catalyst for the reaction. These together make glucose, a simple sugar, and oxygen gas is also given off, a byproduct of the reaction, but essential for life on this planet. See if you can write out the word equation for photosynthesis. So your word equation for photosynthesis should look like this. Carbon dioxide and water, in the presence of sunlight and chlorophyll, produce glucose and oxygen. Now remember, photosynthesis doesn't just occur on land, but also in the water. In the next clip, what is Stella testing for and why?
Uh-oh. Oxygen level down here is getting a bit low. But at least my new plants will help me there. Green plants are vital in maintaining the oxygen level everywhere on Earth. Oxygen we all need to breathe. When plants photosynthesize, they use up carbon dioxide and produce oxygen. This is vital for all us animals on land and sea, including my goldfish Carrot.
Look closely at the pondweed. You see tiny bubbles of gas produced by the leaves.
This test tube has been collecting gas for a few hours. Looks like oxygen to me.
The pondweed has been photosynthesizing this time, taking in dissolved carbon dioxide and, in the presence of sunlight, producing glucose and that all-important oxygen as tiny gas bubbles. And if we do this, the fish tank is now in the dark. So without sunlight, photosynthesis will stop. Here are the key points you need to know about photosynthesis. The ingredients for photosynthesis are carbon dioxide and water in the presence of sunlight and chlorophyll. The products are glucose, a simple sugar, and oxygen, essential for the planet. Can you still remember the word equation for photosynthesis? If not, you could rewind and go over this section again, or move on to the structure and function of the leaf. To make photosynthesis happen, you need these green leaves. These are the food factories, if you like, that produce glucose. Now, leaves are well adapted for photosynthesis. For a start, they have a large surface area, so they can absorb the maximum amount of sunlight. And if we look under a microscope, we can see that the leaf has many tiny holes all over the surface, which are called stomata. These are specialized structures that allow for the exchange of gases, carbon dioxide to pass in and oxygen to pass out during the day. Veins, which you can see here, carry water into the leaf from the roots. And if we go below the surface of the leaf, we can see the palisade cells, which are packed with chloroplasts. The chloroplasts contain the green pigment chlorophyll, which absorbs the sunlight and makes it available for the process of photosynthesis. If you weren't sure of anything, stop and go back. Or for a change, why not use the Bitesize book or try our unique online website? Remember, it's your choice. The third section in this unit looks at respiration. The one thing I am in short supply of now is energy. In fact, to do anything, I need a source of energy. And can you remember where we get our energy from? We get our energy from the food we have eaten by respiration, the process where a supply of oxygen releases energy from our food. Respiration is a chemical reaction which releases readily available energy for just about everything we do, including hard exercise. But sometimes it's important to know exactly how much energy is required, and we need to be able to measure it.
And white balls coming up on the inside, but there's only a short hair between Big Ears and Midnight Streak, and they're coming into the final furlong.
Racehorses certainly look as though they're using a lot of energy when they're running a race. But just how much energy do they need? And how can they get it all from just a handful of hay? I know I'd need to eat a lot more than a handful of hay to make me run that fast.
I'm with Christine Smythe, who knows a lot about what horses need to eat.
They need a tremendous amount of energy. We measure energy in kilojoules. Standing here, we'd be using around 5 kilojoules per minute. And if we were to run a 3-minute race, we'd be using 150 kilojoules. And that would be approximately the energy equivalent of this much beef burger.
That's not much for beef burger. How much energy then would a racehorse need to use?
A racehorse running a 3-minute race would require 65,000 kilojoules.
Wow.
And in order to gain that much energy, he would have to eat the equivalent of 17 beef burgers.
A bucket full of beef burgers, that's a huge amount of energy.
But how can Arnie get that much energy from just eating hay? We can use a bomb colorimeter to measure just how much energy is stored in 1 gram of finely chopped hay. So 1 gram of hay contains 8 kilojoules of energy. So for 1 race, Arnie would have to eat this much hay. But racehorses can't spend all their time eating. So most are also given food pellets, which are very high in carbohydrates. Watch. If we put 1 gram of finely chopped food pellets into the bomb colorimeter, we can see just how good an energy source they are. 1 gram of food pellets provides not 8, but 15 kilojoules of energy.
After all this activity, I need this. The energy values of all foods, including biscuits, can be measured in terms of kilojoules, and we don't need a bomb calorimeter to measure it. Most food packets will say how many kilojoules there are in 100 grams. And here, this packet of biscuits has 2,032 kilojoules per 100 grams. And after I have digested the biscuit, it's then broken down into the simplest units, usually glucose, a simple sugar. So glucose and oxygen are the ingredients needed for respiration. And we can sum up the process of respiration in a word equation. Glucose reacts with oxygen to produce carbon dioxide, water, and energy. Why not stop the tape and practice writing it out until you know it off by heart? There are another couple of facts you really need to get straight about respiration. First of all, respiration is often confused with breathing. It will help if you always try to remember that respiration is a chemical reaction that releases energy. Breathing is simply a physical process that birds and mammals like us use to take oxygen in using our lungs. Secondly, it's not obvious that respiration takes place in plants. You can't see them taking in oxygen. But the next clip looks at a rise in temperature to show that plants also respire.
This experiment shows how plants release energy in respiration as heat. In this container is well-soaked, germinating wheat. The other container is a control. It contains the same amount of water, but is full of dead wheat. Look at the thermometers. The live wheat is a lot warmer than the dead wheat. Respiration is slowly releasing energy as heat.
It's easy to think that because plants photosynthesize, they don't need to respire. Plants produce biomass, but they also do need to unlock the energy again for all the other processes, growing, reproducing, repairing damaged cells, and so on. In fact, the cells of every animal and plant respire, take in oxygen to release energy from glucose. So remember, plants both photosynthesize and respire. Respiration is a chemical process that is carried out in all living cells to release energy. Respiration is not the same as breathing, which is taking air into our lungs. And remember, plants both respire and photosynthesize. For the higher tier paper, the test questions sometimes ask you to apply your knowledge in a different context. So let's try one that does that. Here's a question from a past paper that looks at different levels of carbon dioxide. At first glance, the question looks complicated with lots of facts, so we'll go through it step by step. First of all, we're given a table which contains information about how hydrogen carbonate indicator solution changes colour in different amounts of dissolved carbon dioxide. If the colour of the indicator is reddish-orange, then it means that there's the same amount of carbon dioxide as in the air. Yellow means more carbon dioxide than in the air, and purple means less carbon dioxide than in the air. So that's the table of information we will need to answer the question. On the paper, there's a picture of some test tubes. I've got some real test tubes, each containing hydrogen carbonate indicator. Test tube A contains small snails. Test tube B contains waterweed. C contains snails and waterweed, and D is the control with only the solution. And as we can see, at the start of the experiment, they are all reddish-orange. From our chart, we know that this means that they contain the same amount of carbon dioxide as in the air. Now the question is, if we left these test tubes in the sunlight for 2 hours, what would the colour of the solution in each test tube become, and why? And for this, we need to examine each test tube, think about what's inside it, and go back to our chart to check what colour the indicator solution will have changed to. So here we have our test tubes with the hydrogen carbonate indicator. And how have they all changed after 2 hours? Well, in A, containing the small snails, the colour is yellow. There will be more carbon dioxide than in the air, as the snails will have been carrying out respiration. In B, containing the waterweed, the test tube colour is now purple, showing there is less carbon dioxide because the plant is photosynthesizing and using up the carbon dioxide. In C, containing plants and snails, the reddish-orange stays the same because of both respiration and photosynthesis, keeping the levels of carbon dioxide more or less equal. And D, the control, stays the same. So we have used the chart to work out our answers. If you weren't sure of any of them, why not run through the sections on photosynthesis and respiration again?
To help me remember my equations for photosynthesis and respiration, I wrote them out on pieces of paper and put them in places like my bedroom and even in the bathroom.
In biology, it's quite complicated, so use diagrams and flowcharts instead of writing and writing and writing. It helps you remember more.
This brings us to the end of the biology section in this programme. Remember, the book and the website will help you with more practice questions. Also remember to pace yourself and do your revision in bite-sized chunks. So this would be a good place to take a break. The next section is about chemistry. It's divided into elements, compounds and mixtures, chemical reactions, weathering and the particle model. We'll start with elements, compounds and mixtures. To start with, we'll look at elements. In chemistry, we need to be able to recognize elements, compounds and mixtures from their structures and from their symbols or formulae. So in this next section, we're going to run through the most common elements and compounds you need to know well. First of all, elements. Elements can't be split up into anything simpler. They each contain only one type of particle called atoms. Everything on Earth is made up of elements. There are about 112 different elements, and each one is made up of one type of atom. But the atoms of oxygen will be different from the atoms of gold, which again are different from the atoms of sulfur. Each element has a name and a shorthand symbol to identify it, and you need to know the symbols of the 20 most common elements. With a few exceptions, there are some simple rules about the symbols for elements. To make it easier, first of all, let's split them up into metals and non-metals. So the metal magnesium takes the two letters from its name, M and G. The first letter is always a capital and the second is lowercase. Aluminium is Al. Calcium, which naturally occurs in milk, is Ca. Zinc has its first and third letters to make Zn. The others are a bit more tricky because some are derived from Latin names for the element. Lead has the letters Pb from the word plumbum, which is where we get the word plumber from, as they used to use lead pipes in their work. Silver has the letters Ag from the Latin word argentum. Similar to gold, Au is from aurum. Sodium is Na from natrium. Potassium is K from kalium. Iron is Fe from ferrum. And copper is Cu from cuprum. Remember, the first letter is always a capital and the second a lowercase letter. You also need to know the most common non-metals. These are much easier to remember, as almost always the first letter corresponds with the name of the element. Let's run through them. First, the gases. They're H for hydrogen, O for oxygen, N for nitrogen, which is the main component of fertilizers, Cl for chlorine, used in disinfectants, He for helium, and Ar for argon. Now the solids. S for sulfur, not to be confused with Si for silicon. And finally, C for carbon. If you're not sure of any of them, why not rewind and go through them again, making a note as we go. So an element is made of just one type of atom, such as carbon or gold. But other elements, such as oxygen or hydrogen, exist as molecules. When atoms are joined together, they are called molecules. But remember, they are still made up of only one type of atom. This is oxygen gas. Two atoms of oxygen joined together, which makes it a molecule. This is carbon, just one atom. And this is the gas hydrogen, which, like oxygen, has two atoms joined together, so it's a molecule. So you need to know that elements are pure substances, made up of atoms which are all identical, and some exist as molecules, which are identical atoms joined together. Now let's move on to look at compounds and mixtures. First of all, compounds are made up of two or more elements joined together. To make a compound, the atoms must be from different elements, which join to form a chemical bond. The smallest part of a compound that can exist is called a molecule. Let's have a look at a very common molecule.
Here's a very familiar compound, water. This apparatus uses electricity to release the elements which make up water. Bubbles of gas are released from two electrodes, oxygen bubbles from this one, and big hydrogen bubbles from here. oxygen and hydrogen collect in the top of the tubes. But look, there's twice as much hydrogen as oxygen. Why? When particles join together in a compound, they cling together very firmly. The combinations are called molecules. The particles can only join together in specific combinations. In water's case, it's 2 hydrogen particles for every 1 oxygen particle. No extras are allowed. All molecules in a compound are the same.
And like elements, compounds also have symbols to represent them, called chemical formulae. So water has the chemical formula H2O. This tells us that it contains hydrogen and oxygen atoms, and that there are 2 hydrogen atoms for every 1 oxygen atom. The oxygen atom doesn't have a number after it, as there's only 1. Carbon dioxide is written CO2, showing there are 2 oxygen atoms to every 1 carbon. Remember, if you're writing these yourself, write them accurately with a 2 slightly lower than the letters. A compound is a substance made up of different types of elements joined together chemically. So compounds are always made of molecules. Besides elements and compounds, you also need to know about mixtures. Mixtures are substances that are not chemically joined up and can be easily separated. Air is a good example of a mixture, being made up of several gases. So is ordinary tap water, which has minerals dissolved in it. Orange juice, seawater, and crude oil are other mixtures where the different substances can be separated out. In this next clip, see how many different elements and compounds are used to make up this surprising product.
This recipe is the key to the future. Take 3 liters of water, add sufficient fat to make a small bar of soap. Take enough carbon for 55 pencil leads. Mix with enough phosphorus to produce 135 match heads. A generous helping of calcium always improves the result. Take enough sulfur to produce a couple of stink bombs. Extract every atom of iron and zinc from a galvanized roof tack. Garnish with traces of magnesium and potassium. Season with a pinch of salt. Bake in an oven at 37 degrees for 270 days. Monitor carefully until incubation is complete.
So, how many elements and compounds did you spot? Well, to make a baby, there were 3 compounds, distilled water, fat, and salt, and 8 elements. More seriously, here are some top tips.
Examiners can be very picky when it comes to marking formulae. For example, if you're writing carbon dioxide, the C and the O must be capital letters and the 2 must be lowercase. They won't give you marks for it if it's not obviously like that.
For the higher test papers, you also need to know the chemical formulae for commonly used compounds. Now, when naming compounds, there are 2 useful rules to remember. Rule 1. When 2 elements, such as a metal and a non-metal, combine to make a compound, the non-metal part comes second, and the ending becomes "ide." So when sodium combines with chlorine, the chlorine changes to "ide" to make sodium chloride, common or garden salt. With magnesium and oxygen, the compound is magnesium oxide. Rule 2 is with 3 or more elements, a metal, a non-metal, and oxygen. Here, the non-metal changes to something 8. For instance, the elements copper, sulfur, and oxygen combine to become copper sulfate, CuSO4. And calcium, carbon, and oxygen atoms combine to make calcium carbonate, CaCO3. A particular problem is mixing up ides and eighths. Remember, ides are when 2 elements are joined together. Eighths are when 3 or more are joined together, and one of the elements is oxygen. Can you name these compounds? ZNO, K2CO3, CuSO4, and FeS. Why not stop the tape and have a think about them? So let's have a look at the chemical formulae. ZNO is zinc oxide. K2CO3 is potassium carbonate. CuSO4 is copper sulfate. And FeS is iron sulfide. If you weren't sure of the answer, here are some key points to help you remember the rules. When 2 elements combine, the ending is usually something "-ide", such as sodium chloride. When 3 or more elements combine and one of them is oxygen, the ending will be something "-ate", such as copper sulfate. Next, the periodic table. The 100 or so elements we know about can be put into a table form, which we call the periodic table. The periodic table shows all the elements that exist, using their symbol to represent each one. Now, for your test, you don't need to learn all of this off by heart, but you do need to be familiar with some of its features. First, the periodic table is organized so that the elements belong to certain chemical families. These are elements with similar properties, and they're shown close to each other. The main ones you need to know are the metals on the left and the non-metals on the right. A zigzag line divides the 2 groups up. Secondly, the most reactive metals, such as lithium, sodium and potassium, are over here on the far left. And as we go to the centre of the table, the metals are less reactive. Now, for key stage 3, you don't need to learn all this. If the periodic table comes up in your test, you will always be given a copy on the paper. We're now going to look at chemical reactions. First off, the reactivity series. For the higher tier papers, you need to know the reactivity series of metals well, and remember the order the metals appear in. So, at the top of our list, we have the most reactive metals: potassium, sodium, calcium, magnesium, and aluminium. These metals, particularly the top 3, are very reactive. As we go down the table, the middle group of metals are zinc, iron, tin, lead, and copper, which are less reactive. And right at the bottom of the reactivity table are silver and gold. These are very unreactive, which is why we use them for jewellery, cutlery, and fillings. Now, it's important to know the order of these metals that helps us to predict what will happen in chemical reactions. So here are some tips on remembering the order of metals in the reactivity series.
When you're revising your chemistry, try to remember the order of the reactivity series. It'll help you when it comes to answering questions on the exam paper about displacement reactions, and there's always a question about it somewhere.
The way I remember the reactivity series is by a little rhyme. Pops, stars can make absolute zillions if little children spend generously.
Once we know the order of reactivity in chemistry, we can start to predict what is going to happen in a reaction. Let's look at another experiment. This time we take powdered copper oxide, which looks reddish brown, and add the metal magnesium, which has been ground up into a powder. After mixing the two, we need some heat to get things going. But once started, the reaction is very dramatic. This type of reaction is called a displacement reaction. Displacement literally means taking the place of. Now, there's an important rule to help you. A more reactive metal will always displace a less reactive metal from its compound. So in this experiment, copper is lower than magnesium in the reactivity series, so magnesium is the more reactive metal. Here, the magnesium displaces, takes the place of, copper to become magnesium oxide, and we can write a word equation for the reaction. Magnesium and copper oxide makes magnesium oxide and copper. So another way of looking at a displacement reaction is using a diagram. So in this case, if we take iron and copper sulfate, the iron will push the copper out and it takes up the sulfate. We say the copper is displaced and will appear as a metal deposit. And we can write a word equation for the reaction. Copper sulfate and iron makes iron sulfate and the metal copper. In a displacement reaction, the more reactive metal will always displace a less reactive metal from its compound. We've set up an experiment with a solution of iron nitrate and added the metal copper to it. And in another test tube, we have taken silver nitrate and added copper to it. What do you predict will happen?
Okay, these are displacement reactions. Put the copper in. Okay, you put in the iron nitrate. Right, let's see what happens. Yeah. So what do you think is going to happen?
So in the first part of this question, the reactants are iron nitrate and copper. Can you predict what will happen? Now, part 2.
Okay, should we go on? Right, put the copper and some silver nitrate.
This time, the reactants are silver nitrate and copper. What is going to happen? And write down a word equation. So, the answer to the first part.
I don't think there'll be any reaction because the iron nitrate is higher in the reactivity series than the copper, so there won't be any displacement.
Absolutely right. There is no displacement reaction because the metal iron is higher in the reactivity series than copper. And the answer to the second part, silver nitrate and copper.
I think there'll definitely be some change. Yeah. The colour's going already.
Oh yeah. Yeah, it's because copper is higher in the reactivity series than silver, so it will displace. You can tell there's been a chemical reaction because there's a visible change. It's changing colour. Look, it's gone blue. That must be the copper nitrate.
Oh yeah.
The metal copper has displaced the silver, which can now be seen deposited on the surface, and the blue colour is the copper nitrate. And your word equation would look like this. Silver nitrate plus copper makes silver plus copper nitrate. That brings us to the end of this unit on chemical reactions, and it's a good place to take a break. If you'd like to do more, there are more examples of displacement reactions in the book and on the website. Unit 6 looks at weathering, and this subject is split into physical and chemical weathering. Weathering is the process where rocks and artificial structures are worn away and broken down into smaller pieces, and this is due to either physical or chemical processes. This first section is going to look at the physical process of weathering, and the next section, the chemical process. Surprisingly, the main cause of physical weathering is common or garden water falling as rain. But how does rain break down materials?
Rainwater gets in the cracks in a rock. And to show you what happens, I filled this iron flask with water, and I'm going to put it in ice.
Rainwater gets into the cracks and freezes. The ice expands as it forms, and the force is large enough to split the rock.
Eventually, the rock has so many cracks. This has been very well weathered. Easy.
Water is the only substance that does not contract when it freezes and become a solid. So rocks break up by water repeatedly freezing in the cracks and expanding. Eventually, the rock is weakened and pieces break off. This process is called freeze-thaw weathering. The other type of physical weathering is the effect of the sun. In very hot places during the day, rocks warm up and expand, and at night they cool down and contract. Over many years, this causes the rocks to eventually crack and break into smaller pieces. And this physical weathering is called onion skin weathering. So alternate freezing and thawing of water and the contraction and expansion of rocks are both examples of physical weathering. So let's go on to look at chemical weathering. This is a gargoyle of a lion off a building, and as you can see, he's very worn. His ears have broken off and he's lost a few teeth. Now this has happened mainly by chemical weathering. Chemical weathering is different from physical weathering as it isn't a mechanical process. It's carried out by chemicals in the air or dissolved in rainwater. Now all rain is slightly acidic, and when it falls on materials like this, the acid reacts with the stone and wears it away. Let's take a closer look at the reaction.
Here's the acid. Putting the acid on the limestone.
This time weak hydrochloric acid is used and small amounts are dropped onto the rock.
You can see the carbon dioxide bubbling up and the hydrochloric acid reacting to the limestone.
Now this is on a very small scale. In limestone areas of the country over millions of years, rainwater will react with limestone, which eventually carves out cave systems. Although rainwater is naturally acidic due to carbon dioxide in the air, pollution from industry can make it more acidic. This is what we call acid rain. Sulfur dioxide and oxides of nitrogen are produced by burning fuels and are then released into the atmosphere. These acidic gases mixed with water fall as acid rain. This did have an effect not only on rocks and buildings, but also on plants on land and in rivers and lakes. Stricter controls on industry has meant that this pollution is now far less of a problem. Here are the key points you need to know about physical and chemical weathering. Physical weathering is the process where rocks on the surface are broken up. This is either by alternate freezing and thawing of water in the cracks of rocks, or by the continual expansion and contraction of rocks from the effects of the sun. And chemical weathering is the process where materials are worn away by naturally occurring acid dissolved in rainwater. That brings us to the end of this section on weathering. If you weren't sure of anything, why not rewind and go over the key points? It's also a good place to take a break. Remember, it's your choice. The last unit in chemistry covers the particle model. The particle theory of matter is a really key scientific concept that you need to know and understand well. We use it to explain the properties of solids, liquids and gases, and how matter changes from one state into another. Let's check out those micro marvels again to remind us of the three different states. In a solid, the particles are closely packed and held tightly together. They're not completely still, just vibrating very gently. This explains why solids have a rigid structure and a fixed shape and are hard to compress. The particles in a liquid are also closely packed, but they move over each other. Liquids take on the shape of their container, are hard to compress, flow easily, and have a fixed volume. In gases, the particles are not closely packed. They're spaced out and move around very quickly. This means gases also take the shape of their container, but they are easy to compress and flow readily. But unlike liquids, they have the volume of the container. We most commonly use the word particles to describe solids, liquids, and gases, but test questions will also use the words molecules and atoms. Now, we've been using the word particles to describe both the behavior of molecules and atoms. Though they're different, in the particle theory of matter, we can refer to them both as particles. Another tip is how you draw solids, liquids, or gases. Test questions often ask you to draw the particles or molecules in different states. When you sketch diagrams, make sure you draw at least 12 particles and don't make them too small. To make sure you get all the marks when you draw a solid, make sure all the particles are touching and have a more regular shape. Remember, with a liquid, draw your diagram with most of the particles touching. If they aren't, you will lose marks. And in a gas, the particles are widely spaced and not touching. The next section will look more closely at changes in state, how the particle model is used to describe, for example, the way ice changes to a liquid and then to a gas. When water changes from a solid into a liquid or from a liquid into a gas, we say that a change of state has taken place. When the solid ice changes into liquid water, it has changed from one state of matter into another state of matter. And remember, this is a physical change. The particles themselves haven't changed, just their arrangement or their energy. Let's look more closely. Let's take the solid fat. When it's heated, its particles gain more energy. This makes the particles move about more, which weakens the forces which hold the solid together. This makes the solid expand, and then at a certain temperature, the particles have enough energy to break free from their positions. This is called the melting point, and when a solid turns into a liquid, it's called melting. Then, if we carry on heating the liquid, the particles get even more energy. The energy makes the particles in a liquid move faster, which weakens and breaks the bonds holding them together as a liquid.
The melted butter is beginning to bubble because it's turned into a gas where the particles are even further apart than liquid and will vibrate even more rapidly.
At a certain temperature, called the boiling point, the particles have enough energy to break their bonds, and the liquid turns into a gas. The liquid is now boiling. Let's magnify what's happening here and look at the particle level.
You would see a liquid is made out of many tiny particles jostling for space in the container. When you heat the liquid, the particles jostle more and more. The particles get so excited and so energetic that more and more can escape from the liquid. They become a gas. Once they've escaped from the liquid, the particles spread out. They take up much more space than the poor old particles still squashed in the liquid.
And the opposite happens if heat is taken away. Water vapor has hit this cold milk bottle. As the gas hits the cold glass, it cools down and energy is taken away from the particles. They slow down and get closer together until the gas turns into a liquid. We say the water vapor has condensed back into a liquid. And if more energy is taken away from the liquid, it freezes into a solid at a temperature called the freezing point. Remember, this doesn't just happen to water. Different substances will have different freezing, melting, and boiling points. So the change of state from solid into a liquid is called melting and happens at the melting point of the liquid. Liquid into a solid is called freezing, and happens at the freezing point of the liquid. The change of state from a liquid into a gas is called boiling and happens at the boiling point of the liquid. And the gas changing back into a liquid is called condensing. We can also use the particle theory of matter to explain this. This balloon keeps its shape because of a gas, air. Millions of gas particles move around very quickly and in all directions, constantly hitting the inside surface of the balloon. And it's this continual bombardment which creates the pressure that gives the balloon its shape. Now you can increase the pressure inside this balloon in two ways. We can either put more air in, which means more particles hitting the sides, increasing the pressure, or the other way is to heat the balloon. This increase in temperature gives the particles more energy, and therefore they move faster, colliding with the sides of the balloon more often and with a greater force. But remember, there is air outside the balloon as well.
But there's air all around us, isn't there?
Yes.
And it pushes all the time?
Yeah.
So why can't you feel it pushing you now?
Smart question. You can't feel it because air always presses equally in all directions. It's called air pressure. Even though you can't feel it, ordinary air pressure is very powerful. Watch this. This may look like an ordinary bottle, but it's got holes in the bottom. But when the top is sealed, the air outside pushing up holds the water inside. As the candle burns, it uses up oxygen in the air. The egg seals the top, so no more air can get in. Soon, the candle uses up all the oxygen in the air. There's more air outside the bottle than inside, so it pushes the egg into the bottle.
So the compressed air inside the balloon pushes the sides out and creates pressure on the surface, but the air pressure outside also pushes on the balloon. We can explain pressure by the particle theory of matter. Pressure is caused by the particles or molecules hitting a surface. The pressure will increase if there are more particles or the temperature is increased. An increase in temperature has two effects. The particles hit the walls harder and hit the walls more often. Here's a question from a higher tier paper about gas pressure. It's got several parts, so we'll go through them one at a time. A girl, that's me, pumps up a bicycle tyre which has gone flat. As she does, she notices that the pump becomes hot. The air going into the tyre is warmed by the pumping. So in part A, the question asks, what effect will this have on the motion of the gas molecules in the air of the tyre? The clue in the question here is the word motion. The marker is looking for a description of how the gas molecules are moving. And the answer is that with an increase in temperature, the gas molecules will speed up. They will move faster. Now part B. When the air in the tyre becomes hotter, the pressure rises. Give one reason in terms of the motion of gas molecules in air why the pressure rises. Stop the tape and have a think. You only need to give one reason to answer this question, but there are several answers that are all correct. The pressure will rise because the molecules will hit the tyre wall more frequently. Or you could have said they hit the tyre wall harder or faster. All these answers are correct. Now part C. Next, I force more air into the tyre, so the pressure in the tyre increases. Explain why a larger number of gas molecules increases the pressure in the tyre. So I'm now putting more air molecules into the tyre. Why will this increase the pressure? More air molecules will mean that there are now more collisions with the tyre wall. The key phrase in this answer is collisions with the tyre wall. A common mistake is to say there are more collisions generally, and this wouldn't get you a mark. These last few questions may have sounded similar, but if you read them carefully, they are looking for slightly different answers. If you weren't sure of the answers, why not rewind and go over the questions again? The particle theory of matter can be used to describe another phenomenon. I can smell this food and perfume because of a process called diffusion. The particles of perfume that I have sprayed on my arm and from the food can now be smelt throughout this studio. This is because they have spread out by the action of the moving air particles. The perfume particles move away from where there is a high density of them on my arm to where there is a low density. Now, this is a very slow process because the perfume particles will be hit by air particles moving in every direction. This stops them making forward progress, but eventually they will completely spread out to fill this entire studio. And diffusion doesn't just happen in air particles.
Okay, I'm just going to put some crystals in.
The surface of the water's turning more purple, where the crystals were high concentration, and then it's diffusing out to a lower concentration.
So diffusion is the random movement of particles or molecules to fill all the available space. The particles move from a higher to a lower concentration. And diffusion mainly happens in gases and liquids. This completes all the units on chemistry in this programme. Make sure that you really understand the particle model and can use it to describe how solids, liquids and gases can behave. Rewind and play this section again if you need to go over it, and don't forget the book and the website. You will remember more if you revise in bite-sized chunks. So this would be a good place to take a break. We'll now move on to physics, and units 8 to 11 cover the material you need to revise for the higher tier paper. Colour, forces in motion, electromagnets and conservation of energy. We'll kick off with colour. First, we'll look at the dispersal of white light and coloured filters. To recap, we know that white light is not just a single colour, but it's made up of all the colours of the rainbow. If we use a prism and shine a light through it, we can see those different colours. The glass prism disperses the white light, and the proper name for this rainbow effect is a spectrum. And this is why the sky is blue and a sunset is orange. I think we need to take a closer look.
Well, I understand about the sun producing light and the Earth's atmosphere being quite thick. What's that to do with colour?
Let me show you. I've filled this tank with water, and I'm going to put this milk powder in it, and this will represent our atmosphere. It's actually quite a good representation of the atmosphere, because the milk powder represents all the water droplets, all the dust, all the pollen, and all the other particles in the atmosphere. And this is our sun, producing nice white light, just like it does in space. The sunlight in space is white. Now, if I lower the sunlight into our atmosphere, you'll see what happens.
Oh, yes. Well, the light around the beam appears to be blue.
Right.
And if I look round into the end of the tank, well, the sun's light, it looks yellow.
Well, yes, that's because, as you know, white light is made up of all the colours in our spectrum. Now, all these colours get pushed about by our atmosphere, and it just so happens that the blue light is the one that's scattered most of all. And so when you shine a white light into the atmosphere, all the blue light is scattered all over the place, all over the sky, in fact. And of course, when you take the blue colours away from the sunlight, you're left with a yellowish looking mixture, and that's why the sun looks yellow.
Now, you don't need to revise this last clip for your test, but you do need to know that we can see colour because white light is dispersed. So the different colours we see in the sky are due to how much white light is dispersed through the atmosphere. Another way to see coloured light is through coloured filters. Coloured filters are translucent materials which allow a single colour to pass through, and that colour is the colour of the filter.
If I put in a red filter, only red passes through. The rest of the colours are stopped or absorbed. Green filter, only green passes through. Again, the other colours are absorbed.
By using these two coloured filters, this studio is lit by blue and magenta light. Remember, the filter only allows one colour through and absorbs all the other colours. Without them, we would just have white light. So we can see colours because of the dispersion of white light, which gives us a spectrum, the colours of the rainbow. And the colour of a filter determines the colour of the light that passes through it. Next, objects in white and coloured light.
We can only see anything because light falls on its surface. What happens when light reaches this surface? It's stopped or absorbed. With this glass, it's allowed through, and with this mirror ball, it's reflected back. White light is made up of all the colours of the rainbow, but I'm just going to use the primary colours, blue, green and red, to make it easier for you to see what's going on. If we shine our white light on different coloured objects, look what happens.
A red object absorbs all the colours of the spectrum except for red, which is reflected. We can show this if I turn the cube to this special side. It's a similar story with this green side. All the colours are absorbed except green.
So coloured objects reflect only the colour or colours that they're made up of. For instance, this blue ball reflects blue light and absorbs all the other colours, so it appears blue. These white pieces of paper reflect all colours, so they appear white. And a black object, like this top hat, absorbs all colours and reflects none back, and so it appears black. Remember, in white light, a coloured object reflects only the light that's its own colour. But what's going on here?
Stella, we've got another problem for you. Why do our T-shirts keep changing colour?
My white one changes with whatever colour shines on it. It looks red under red light, green under green light, and blue under blue light.
My red shirt goes black under green light. And my cyan shirt goes green under green light, blue under blue light, but black under red. What's going on, Stella?
First of all, white objects in coloured light. Now, they're easy. They just reflect back the colour of the light shining on them. So, in red light, this piece of paper appears red. In blue light, the white paper appears blue, reflecting back the blue light, and so on. Now, let's look at coloured objects, this time in coloured lights. Let's take this blue and red ball. In red light, the red pattern reflects back red light, but the blue patches look black, as there is no blue light to reflect back, and the red light has been absorbed. And the opposite happens in blue light. Now, the blue pattern looks blue, but the red patches look black, as there is no red light to reflect, and the red areas have absorbed all the blue light. The colour of an object is the colour of the light it reflects. White objects reflect all of the colours and absorb none, and black objects absorb all colours and reflect none. And all objects, white or coloured, seem to change colour in coloured light, reflecting back their own colour and absorbing all other colours. Here's a question from a past test paper. A white envelope of photographic paper has written on it in large red letters, "Warning, open only by the light of a red safe light." If this envelope is put into a photographic darkroom where the only light is from a red lamp, what colour does the white envelope appear, and what colour will the red writing appear? So the answer you should have come up with is that the white envelope will appear red and the red writing will appear red. The white envelope, being white, reflects all the colours of the spectrum, but as only red light is available, the white only reflects back the red light. And now, if we were to switch the red light off and turn a green lamp on, what colour will the white envelope and the red writing be now, and explain why? What did you get? Well, the envelope will now appear green and the red writing will appear black. That's because this time the white envelope reflects the green light, so it appears green, and the red writing now appears black as it has no red light to reflect and it absorbs the green light. This brings us to the end of this section on colour. Remember, there are more practice questions in our Key Stage 3 revision book and on our website. Time to take a break. Next, forces and motion. And first, speed. In physics, it's important to be able to describe and measure things accurately. One way to describe the motion of an object is by measuring its speed. And to work out the speed of anything, we need to know two facts. If I push this car along the studio floor, to work out its speed, we need to know the distance it has travelled and the time it has taken. And the best way of remembering this is by using a formula triangle. The equation is speed equals distance divided by time, and we can remember this because we can say speed is so many kilometres per hour. You can also remember the phrase CDOT, which stands for speed is distance over time. Now, if we turn the speed equals distance over time equation into a triangle, it looks like this. If we know any two components in this triangle, we can work out the third, like this. Speed equals distance divided by time. We know that one. Distance equals speed multiplied by time. Time equals distance divided by speed. So if a test question asks you to find out the distance an object travels, you will be given the speed and the time, which you can then multiply together to find out the distance. The other important thing to remember when working out calculations in physics is to use the correct units. For example, there are 3 common units for speed which you should know about. First, meters per second, written m/s. Secondly, miles per hour, written mph or miles/h. And the third one is kilometers per hour, km/h.
For the speed distance time formula, I remembered it from a rap that we did. Here's part of the rap. I am distance and I do dangle at the top of this triangle. Although they think it is a crime, they hold me up. Yo, speed and time.
I remembered the equation for speed by remembering the speed distance time triangle. And the triangle always starts with D, then S, and then T, which is in alphabetical order.
Examiners expect you to be very accurate with your units, particularly in physics questions. For example, when you're doing speed calculations, they'll expect you to give the units as meters per second. When you're doing pressure calculations, they'll expect you to give the units in newtons per meter squared. Be careful, don't leave out the units, you'll lose marks if you do.
Here's a question about speed from a past test paper. which uses the 2-second rule for car drivers from the Highway Code. In the Highway Code, it says leave enough space between you and the vehicle in front so that you can pull up safely if it suddenly slows down. A 2-second time gap may be sufficient. Use stationary objects like lampposts to help you keep a 2-second gap. So the question is, if the traffic is moving at 20 meters per second and a driver is keeping to the 2-second rule, what is the distance between the driver and the car in front? I think our formula triangle will be useful here. The answer is 40 meters. Let's see how we work it out. We have our formula triangle, distance, speed and time. Here we know the speed is 20 meters per second and the time is 2 seconds, and we want to know the distance. From the triangle, distance equals the speed multiplied by the time. That's 20 times 2, 40. But remember, the unit for distance in this case is meters, so the answer is 40 meters. In part B of the same question, it says that the traffic increases its speed to 25 meters per second, but the driver stays the same distance from the car in front. She sees the car in front pass a lamppost. How long will it take her to reach the same lamppost? A tip here is to read the question carefully and find out what answer they're looking for, not what you think they're looking for. So in this question, we're looking for how long, the time taken. So this time we know the speed and the distance travelled. We're told the speed has gone up to 25 meters per second, but the distance travelled, the distance between the cars, has stayed the same. That's 40 meters. If we slot those into our formula triangle, we see that the time equals the distance divided by the speed, which is 40 divided by 25, which is 1.6. Don't forget the units, seconds. So first of all, let's just sort out what pressure is. By just standing here, I'm creating pressure. My feet are pushing down on an area of the studio floor. It's the same if I use my hand to lean on this column. So a force acting on a surface causes pressure. But if I change my trainers here for something more elegant, a stiletto heel, the pressure from this shoe on the studio floor will increase. Now, how can that be when my weight, the force I exert on the floor, stays the same? Let's take a closer look.
If you stand on something squashy like sand, you can easily see the pressure caused by your weight acting over the area of the sole of your shoes. It's the pressure which produces footprints. I weigh the same, but my footprint is deeper wearing this than this. The pressure depends on the area of the sole of the shoe. So, as my weight stays the same, if I double the area of the sole of my shoes, I should halve the pressure. As the area gets bigger, the pressure gets smaller. So, the footprints from my red shoes are deeper than the green ones. They're not really me, are they?
So pressure is dependent on the force that is pushing and the area over which it pushes. The relationship between all three, pressure, force and area, can be summarized using this formula. Pressure equals force divided by area. And we can turn this into another formula triangle, so that as with the speed triangle, if we know two of these components, we can work out the third. So pressure equals force divided by area. We know that. Force equals pressure times area. And area equals force divided by pressure. And remember your units again. Force is measured in newtons, a capital N. Area is measured in meters squared, so pressure is measured in newtons per meter squared. Now, the amount of pressure exerted on a surface has some important practical applications. If you apply a force over a large surface area, it results in a small pressure, which is why skis or snowshoes spread your weight over the surface of the snow. And if you apply the same force over a small surface area, it results in a big pressure, like the point of a drawing pin. So you need to know that pressure is how much force is exerted on a certain area. Pressure equals force divided by area. And you can use the formula triangle to help complete any calculations involving pressure. That brings us to the end of this section on forces and motion. Before we move on, check if you can remember the formulae for speed, distance and time, and for pressure, force and area. Or you could try out the book or the website for some more practice questions. Now on to electromagnets. First, their structure and strength. The structure of an electromagnet can seem quite complicated, so let's run through one step by step. First of all, a current going through a wire causes a magnetic field around the wire. And if we take a straight piece of wire and wrap it around a test tube, we can make a coil of wire or solenoid. Now, if we connect it up so an electric current runs through the coiled wire, what happens? You get a magnetic field around the coil that looks very similar to the magnetic field of a bar magnet. And this is the basis of the electromagnet. And unlike a bar magnet, an electromagnet can be switched on and off. So this coil of wire is the basis of our electromagnet, and we can change the strength of the magnetic field it creates in a number of different ways. The students have a simple coil of wire attached to a voltmeter which provides the electric current. So what do we need to make an electromagnet?
This is an electromagnet just with the coils. Let's test it we'll see if we'll pick up any nails. It doesn't work. No. How about if we try it with a pencil? It doesn't work either. No. How about if we try it with an iron core? It picks up some nails.
The magnetic effect is increased if an iron core is inserted into the coil.
And if I switch it off, all the nails drop off. How can we increase the magnetism? We can increase the voltage. Let's try that.
Increasing the voltage increases the current flowing through the wire.
It picks up nails.
Then back to the original current. They now replace the coil with another one, with more turns in the wire.
More nails are picked up. What happens when you turn off the voltage? It falls off as well. Okay.
So you need to know that electromagnets are temporary and their magnetic fields can be turned on and off. The strength of an electromagnet can be increased in 3 ways. By increasing the size of the current and by making more turns in the wire, we will increase the magnetic field. And by adding a soft iron core inside the coil, we will also concentrate the magnetic effect. Knowing that electromagnets can be turned on and off makes them very useful, and they're used in a large number of different appliances. They make loudspeakers vibrate and motors go round, and they create recordings onto audio tapes, computer discs, and videotapes. They're also used in relays. This is a switch where a small electric current will switch on a much larger current, and relays are often used for safety reasons. Electromagnets are also used in electric bells. When the current is turned on, the electromagnet attracts the hammer, which clangs the bell but also breaks the circuit. This then turns off the electromagnet, which releases the hammer. The arm springs back to its original position, making the circuit complete again. And so it goes on very quickly, as we can hear. So let's look at a question from a test paper about electromagnets. This is a diagram showing an electromagnet used in a door lock. We can see the push switch, the electromagnet in the door frame, the iron bolt in a spring, and a section of the door. So the question is, if the push switch is closed and the door unlocks, explain in detail how this happens. 3 marks have been awarded for this answer, so we're probably looking for 3 points. So what is the sequence of events from when the switch is closed to the door unlocking? Well, the switch makes the circuit complete and a current flows. The iron core in the coil will become magnetized, producing a magnetic field. The iron bolt is then attracted to the electromagnet and springs out of the door frame, unlocking the door. The examiner will also be looking to make sure you have got the order of events correct. So remember, when the switch is on, first of all, a current flows, which magnetizes the iron core, which then attracts the iron bolt. This brings us to the end of electromagnets. If you weren't sure of the answer to the question, why not go through this section again? Here are some more top tips to help you with your revision.
For revising my physics, I used a lot of flashcards, and I even had my little brother help me.
I revise for about 20 minutes at a time, and then I have a break so I can keep my concentration better.
When you're revising, do try and stay fresh. And you can do that best by making sure you do different things. Don't concentrate on one thing for too long at any one time. So, for example, you can make yourself revision cards, you can read your notes, you can try test papers, you can get somebody to test you. Whatever you do, vary it.
Our last physics unit is about the conservation of energy. First, energy transfer and storage. In Programme 2, we looked at different types of energy, but let's just remind ourselves of the 7 different forms. Light energy from anything luminous like the sun, light bulbs or candles. Electric energy whenever there's an electric current flowing. The hotter something is, the more thermal heat energy it has. There's sound energy from anything that makes a noise, vocal cords, speakers, noisy machinery. Chemical energy is energy stored chemically, which can then be released. Food, fuel, and batteries all have stored chemical energy. Potential energy is stored energy that's ready to be released. For instance, high skydivers about to leave an aeroplane. And finally, kinetic energy is the energy of any moving object. Now, the tricky bit is that energy can not only be stored, but can also be transferred from one form into another. Watch this next clip and make a note of some of the energy transfers you can spot.
This kettle needs energy to boil the water. And it's energy that makes this radio work, or it will when I wind it up. I'm not creating the energy, I'm transferring it from my muscles to the spring, where it's stored until it's needed. Energy transfers are responsible for just about everything in the universe, and they're not difficult to spot. The energy that was stored in the wood is being released by burning, and gives off heat and light, and if you listen, sound as well.
No signal in here. Tried outside.
Another energy transfer. But where did the energy come from for my muscles? It's been through quite a few transfers to get to me. The energy was transferred to me through my breakfast. The energy was stored in this food. When I ate it, some of it went into keeping me alive and warm. The rest was stored for when I needed it. But where did the plants get their energy from?
The sun is the main source of energy used on Earth. Now, plants capture their energy from the sun by photosynthesis, which involves green plants turning light, carbon dioxide and water into food, which is their stored energy. So all along the way from the sun to me, energy is being stored and released. Now, food is an energy store, and any stored energy is called potential energy. So when the energy from food is released, I can use it. I can move my muscles. And when I turn the handle, the potential energy from my muscles is transferred and stored in the spring. And when I release the spring, the energy is transferred into electricity and the radio will work. Now, it produces sound and some heat is generated as well. And that's why the radio feels warm. No, still nothing. It's not really surprising. I'm nowhere near any radio stations.
Well, there were lots of different energy transfers going on there. Let's run through a few of them again. So here we have heat energy to light energy and sound energy. The food provides chemical energy, which is transferred into thermal, kinetic and potential energy. Light energy from the sun is transferred into chemical energy and potential energy stored in the plants. When Stella winds the spring up, kinetic energy from the moving arm is transferred into potential energy stored in the spring. When the spring in the radio is released, the potential energy is transferred into kinetic, electric, sound and thermal energy. Lots of examples of energy transfers.
This is the radio from the plane. I've built a machine to try and make it work.
Now, what energy transfers are going on here?
The bucket fills with water. High up, it has potential energy. When it's heavy enough, it starts to fall. As it comes down, the potential energy transfers to movement or kinetic energy in the wheel. As the wheel turns, kinetic energy is transferred to this dynamo. It also produces sound and a bit of heat too. The dynamo transfers kinetic energy into electricity. And the radio transfers the electricity to sound and some heat.
So the whole system is mainly a transfer of potential energy and kinetic energy. Now, only 6% of the potential energy the bucket had is going to the radio. So it's not very efficient, but it's very useful.
So we know that energy can be transferred from one form to another. But as we saw in the clip, only 6% of the energy from the bucket went into the radio. So Stella's system wasn't very efficient. What happened to the other 94%? Well, one of the key points about energy you need to understand well is that energy never disappears. It's never destroyed. It's always transferred from one form into another. And in the case of Stella's invention, the energy that didn't pass into the radio would have been wasted energy in the form of thermal energy and sound energy. No energy is ever destroyed. This is what we call the principle of conservation of energy. Energy can never be created nor destroyed. It's transferred from one form into another. Another important fact about energy is that it's often only useful when it can be transferred from one form into another. When you think about it, all useful machines use one kind of energy and give out another. For instance, this light bulb converts electric energy into light energy so we can see by it. This radio transfers the chemical energy stored in the batteries into sound energy. And this kettle converts electric energy into heat energy, which is what we need to boil the water. One form of energy transferred into another useful form. These are really important key points to get to grips with. First of all, the principle of conservation of energy, which you need to learn. It states that energy can never be created nor destroyed, but is transferred from one form into another. So energy is never lost completely, but it can be wasted and become something less useful, like thermal energy or sound. And remember, energy can be made more useful when it's converted from one form to another. Here's a question about energy transfers from a past paper. It's about a bell in a church tower that's attached to a wheel and balanced upside down. From the edge of the wheel is a rope that the bell ringer can pull to set the bell ringing. The energy given out by the bell was originally stored in the bell ringer. So the question is, describe the main sequence of useful energy transfers which take place when the bell ringer rings the church bell. Now 3 marks are on offer for this answer, so you're looking for 3 energy transfers. Stop the tape and have a go. So what's going to happen? The bell will start moving and then fall the rest of the way round and make a sound. But that's just describing what happens and won't get any marks. The question wants to know about the energy transfers that are taking place. So let's have a closer look. So first, chemical energy stored in the bell ringer's muscles is transferred through the rope to become kinetic energy in the bell. As the bell begins to swing, kinetic energy changes to potential energy. And finally, the potential energy in the swinging bell is transferred into sound energy in the metal and the air. It's quite complicated, so you may want to go through the question and answer again. If you feel happy, you can move on to the next section on temperature and thermal energy. First of all, let's sort out what we mean by temperature and heat. For a start, they represent different things. Temperature is a measurement used to measure how hot something is, and its unit is degrees. Heat is a form of energy, often called thermal energy, and we measure it in joules. The trouble is that we commonly use the word temperature in the wrong way. For instance, when we're ill or feverish, we say we have a temperature, when what we really mean is that the temperature when we are ill is higher than our normal measure of temperature. Let's take a closer look.
Temperature is measured in degrees, and the scale we use mostly nowadays was worked out by a Swedish astronomer called Celsius. Now, a thermometer would be useful for me to check that the cave isn't too cold for my plants. But this one hasn't got a scale. Probably could make one. The bulb is surrounded by melting ice, and the ethanol has had time to settle down. It's stopped moving. The ethanol is dyed blue so we can see it. Ice is frozen water, and this mark indicates the freezing point of water, which Celsius called 0 degrees.
Heating the ice will turn it to water. The energy in the water is being transferred into the ethanol, so it raises its temperature. The heated ethanol moves up the tube because it's expanding.
The water is now boiling, and the ethanol has stopped rising. This mark is the boiling point of water, which Celsius called 100 degrees. Now, by dividing the distance equally between the 2 points, we get a scale. And the level of the ethanol will tell us the temperature of whatever's surrounding it. So, if I leave this here, it will tell me the temperature of the cave.
So temperature and thermal energy, heat, are not the same thing. This sparkler is extremely hot, and if I touched it, I would get burnt. This basin, full of warm water, is at a much lower temperature than the sparkler. I can put my hand into it. But which do you think has the greatest heat energy? In fact, although the water is at a lower temperature, it contains more thermal energy. This is because there are far more particles moving about in the body of water than at the tip of the sparkler. The atoms in the sparkler are vibrating a lot, but there are far fewer of them, so the total energy is much smaller than in the basin of warm water. So you need to know that temperature and heat are different. Temperature is a measure of how hot something is, and we measure temperature in degrees Celsius. Heat is thermal energy, and it's measured in joules. We're now going to look at what happens when there are differences in temperature. Thermal energy is only transferred if there's a temperature difference between two places, and the heat always travels from a hotter to a colder place. This can happen in three different ways, called conduction, convection, and radiation. Let's look at conduction first.
This metal bar is covered in a special material that changes colour when it gets hot. The energy is transferred from the water to the bottom of the bar, so it gets hotter. The changing colours show the energy transferring along the metal. But what is actually happening?
Particles in a solid are vibrating all the time. How much depends on how hot they are. More energy means more vibration. The metal bar is heated at the bottom, and the energy moves from one particle to the next, making each in turn vibrate faster. The energy always moves from hot areas to cooler ones.
Conduction is when vibrating particles pass on their extra vibrational energy to neighbouring particles. That's why a metal cup full of hot water feels too hot to hold. The thermal energy from the hot water is conducted through the metal to my hand. But this polystyrene cup is safe to pick up. The thermal energy isn't conducted through the material from the hot water to my hands. Metals are good conductors, while the polystyrene is a poor conductor, but a good insulator. The second way thermal energy travels from hot things to cold things is called convection. This is where heated material moves in bulk to a cooler region and takes the heat with it. For example, this is how radiators heat up a room. The air above a radiator warms up first and rises to colder parts of the room. Colder air replaces the warmer air and again rises, so a convection current is created. The third way thermal energy moves from hot areas to cold is by radiation. All hot objects radiate heat to their surroundings by invisible waves. Unlike convection and conduction, these waves don't need particles of matter to travel through. This means that energy waves can pass through a vacuum, and that's how the sun's rays reach the Earth. A thermogram is a special camera that is sensitive to thermal energy, and here we have Femi demonstrating.
You can see it on my face. It's different colours depending on how warm various bits of my face are.
My eyes are hottest, my nose is cooler, and my green hair coolest of all.
First of all, thermal energy is only transferred if there is a temperature difference, and heat can be transferred in three different ways. Conduction is when vibrating particles bump into other particles and pass on their energy. Convection is when a hotter region, such as water or air, moves in bulk to a cooler region, taking the heat with it. And finally, radiation. Here, hot objects radiate thermal energy to their surroundings by invisible energy waves that do not need particles of matter to travel through. Brilliant! You have come to the end of this third science programme in the Key Stage 3 Bite-Size Revision series. Don't forget that to complete all your revision, you should look at programmes 1 and 2 as well. Remember always to plan your revision time well ahead and give yourself plenty of breaks. And don't forget the book and our own unique online website that go with these programmes. Whatever you do, remember, it's your choice.
Details of all BBC Learning Zone programmes can be found on CFAX pages 630 to 635.
Now on BBC Learning Zone, the focus is on physics in a 2-hour programme that has been updated and improved with new and revised material to match the new curriculum.
Hello and welcome to GCSE Bitesize. This programme will help you with your GCSE Science Physics exams. There are other programmes about biology and chemistry, and they'll all help towards a grade C in your Double Science Award. There's also a higher tier science programme for those who want to go further. The best way to revise with Bitesize is to work through the video in bite-sized chunks, tackling one topic at a time. Each programme is full of useful information and sample questions for you to try. And there's more in the GCSE Bitesize books and on the GCSE Bitesize website at www.bbc.co.uk/revision. This Foundation Physics programme is divided into 6 sections: electricity, forces and motion, waves, the Earth and beyond, energy resources and transfer, and radioactivity. You can use the timings on the menu and the clock in the corner to go straight to the topic you want to study. First, electricity. The section on electricity is divided into energy transfer in circuits, mains electricity, and electric charge. First, energy transfer in circuits. Here's a quick reminder of what circuit diagrams and their component parts look like. To start with, these are some of the standard symbols used in the electrical circuits you might see in your exam. You'll also need to use them yourself if you're asked to draw a circuit diagram. They are a single-cell battery, a switch, 2 symbols for a lamp, a fixed resistor and a variable resistor, and an ammeter and voltmeter. Here's a simple circuit with a battery, a switch and a lamp connected in series. When the switch is closed, a current begins to flow, pushed around the circuit by the battery. The current leaving the battery is the same as the current returning to the battery. Because all the components in the circuit are connected one after the other in series, the current is the same everywhere in the circuit. In this case, 0.2 amps. Current is measured in amps, with an ammeter, which can be connected in series with each component to measure the current flowing at that point. This is a parallel circuit, where the current can split up and go around different branches of the circuit. The current flowing in different branches can be different depending on how easy it is for the current to flow that way. Ammeters connected in different branches of the circuit will show different measurements. One thing we do know is that the total current flowing into any point in a parallel circuit is the same as the total current flowing out of it. For example, at the junction where the wires join, there's 0.6 amps flowing into that point and 0.2 amps flowing out down one branch and 0.4 amps flowing out down the other. That's 0.6 amps altogether flowing out from that point. Next, we'll look at ways of changing the current in a circuit. The current in a circuit can be changed either by changing the voltage or by changing the resistance in the circuit. First, changing the voltage. We're most familiar with the voltage in the case of a battery, where the voltage is the difference in energy between its 2 terminals. In fact, voltage is the difference in the energy between any 2 points in a circuit. Voltage is measured in volts with a voltmeter. To measure the voltage, you connect the voltmeter in parallel with the component. In this case, the voltage across the battery is 6 volts, while the voltage across each lamp is 3 volts. More battery cells in the same circuit mean a higher voltage and a bigger current. In this circuit, if the battery produces 3 volts, the current is 0.1 amps. If it's 6 volts, it's 0.2 amps. And if it's 9 volts, it's 0.3 amps. The other way of changing the current in a circuit is to change the resistance. One way to do this is to change the number of components, such as bulbs, in the circuit. Bulbs are designed to offer resistance to the flow of electricity. That's why they glow. More bulbs in the circuit means a greater resistance and smaller current. Adding different resistors in the circuit can also change the resistance in the circuit. The greater the resistance, the smaller the current. Resistance is measured in ohms, written using the Greek letter omega. An easier way to change the resistance is to use a variable resistor that can change its value. Again, the greater the resistance, the smaller the current. The smaller the resistance, the greater the current. Resistors are specially designed to offer resistance to the flow of current. They're used in electric and electronic circuits to control the flow of electricity through the different components. In a circuit, energy is spent overcoming resistance. This energy is given off as light or heat.